I'm not in the governor's race because I'm running for Attorney General, and it's a job that I think I have done exceptionally well over the past 11 and almost, I don't know, 3/4 years at this point. During that time, I would say that the state has faced sort of an unprecedented economic crisis and therefore fiscal crisis that impacted the budget as well as the people of the state. And so during this past over 10 years, I've really focused on using the authority of the office both to bring in revenue for the state as well as to go after a lot of the perpetrators of the economic crisis in the first place and make sure that homeowners as well as our communities and pension systems get relief from what occurred. So if I want, I'd like to spend a minute, you're okay with me spending a minute telling about the revenues and whatnot. So since I've been the Attorney General, our office has brought in well over $10 billion in revenues to the state. On top of that, I've been able to secure through a series of investigations, lawsuits, and settlements over $2.8 billion in relief for homeowners, communities, and our pension systems. Through the enforcement work that we do of the Public Utilities Act, I've been able to either save or have refunded to utility ratepayers over $2 billion. In addition, looked for opportunities where we can better enforce our laws and make sure that, we're bringing in money to the state, in particular when the state's been defrauded. So Medicaid fraud has been a priority in the office, as well as some of the innovative things that we've been doing with the Department of Revenue, in particular going after gas station owners and operators for sales tax evasion. We've brought in now over $100 million in sales tax that should have been remitted to the state but was not in the first place. And so in terms of trying to make sure that the state is not in a position where they have to engage in further cuts or the state is in a position where we don't need to be looking at increasing taxes, as well as making sure that the financial stability of the people who are living in this state is more secure. We've really used all of the laws that we have, all the tools that we have to do that. I would say right now we're seeing two newer, but certainly not necessarily even new, but certainly increasing issues where we're focused on. Student loan debt is enormous. There are an estimated 40 million Americans who currently hold $1.2 trillion in outstanding student loan debt. And 2 years ago, I think the fastest growing consumer fraud complaint category that I received in the office revolved around that. And so we've done a series of investigations and lawsuits against some of the predatory for-profit institutions, as well as dealing with some of the scam artists that are now preying on that group of people, the folks that used to prey on the people who were struggling to pay their mortgages, and then they moved to people who were struggling to pay their credit card debt. They've now moved to the people who are trying to pay down their student loan debt. And so you've probably heard some of the commercials on the radio, they say, we can reduce your student loans by half. We can completely eliminate your student loan debt. Call us now. When you call them, what they really want is a credit card number and a large payment, usually $400 or $500 up front, as much as $1,200 up front. So I'm the first Attorney General in the country to have sued those scam artists. We've got about 12 or more investigations that are going on of other entities engaged in the same type of fraud. In addition, identity theft. I bring that up as kind of the example of the old but new issue that we're contending with. So back in 2006, before the economic crisis hit, identity theft was the #1 consumer fraud issue that was being reported to us. At that point, I actually started an identity theft unit. We've got an identity theft hotline. So far, we've helped over 35,000 people in our state remove over 26 million, closer to $27 million in fraudulent charges from people's credit. And last year, when the Target security breach was announced, and then it was, the rapid succession of Michaels, Neiman Marcus, then everybody from eBay to Sony, and then most recently, Chase, Jimmy John's, Fidelity, Jewel. You guys have had to deal with Schnucks as well down here. Advocate Healthcare, which is very, prevalent throughout the state. So a lot of work on that front, both in terms of we do actual investigations. of those breaches to see what took place and how we can prevent them from happening in the future, as well as making sure that we understand why and make sure we can address those systems to improve them, but also looking at what we should be doing in terms of notification. So I worked a number of years ago to pass Illinois' breach identification notification law to make sure that when a breach occurs, your credit card information, your debit card information, your other personal financial information is compromised, that we're able to actually notify people so that they can better watch after their own accounts and their credit. Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
Doing fine.
I'm Lisa.
I'm Clarissa.
I'm kind of just monologuing here, so join us. So that's a lot of the work that I've done, revenues for the state, consumer fraud issues for people of the state. In addition, I put an enormous priority on protecting children. So I actually hold a federal grant to run the Illinois Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. We're involved in our own investigations where we actually go after some of the worst people viewing and trading, downloading child pornography, in part because FBI studies indicate 40 to 70% of those people are likely to engage in what we, I think, charitably refer to as contact offenses. And so we're actually looking at known images of child pornography, the videos and the images of infants and toddlers being raped. And I can tell you that from time to time when we go in to execute search warrants, we will end up in situations where we find a very young child in the bed in the house of one of these sex offenders. In addition, the work overall with the Illinois Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, we train law enforcement throughout the state. And so law enforcement agencies that we work with have been involved in over 800 arrests of sex offenders in our state. So that remains a priority, and we remain very busy on that front. A lot of work protecting seniors, which kind of goes back to not just the nursing home issues that we've been working on over the years, but also the consumer fraud. Unfortunately, on the consumer fraud front, seniors, African Americans, people from immigrant communities tend to be the top targets of consumer fraud scams. Also, you've probably heard we're working on trying to pass legislation in this coming session that will give family members the opportunity, if they so desire, to put in place a camera so that they can better monitor their loved ones who are in nursing homes. Something that's been passed and allowed in 4 states at this point. They've tried to pass this, I think, in about 17 states. And Illinois is one of the states where we've tried, and so I think we've got a better chance of it at this point. But I think it's important to do. So seniors, children, I talked to you about a lot of the homeowners' work as well as all of us as consumers in terms of identity theft. And finally, let me talk about a last piece that I know is very important to everybody in this room and all of us, and that's dealing with the deficit of trust that I think far too many people have in government, top to bottom, in the state of Illinois. And on that front, while I do not serve in the same role as a state's attorney, we have had numerous opportunities where, certainly in the aftermath of Rod Blagojevich's tenure, we've been able to go to the legislature and ask for and receive expanded powers, in particular putting in place a statutory public access counselor that is overwhelmingly busy and gets busier every year. Right now, it's approximately 325 requests for review that we get every month.
Who is that person for you now?
Sarah Pratt.
Okay.
And so that would have been, that's now. Last year it was, I think, 285 a month. And so wildly busy. I think we've issued approximately 55 to 60 binding opinions since the public access counselor has been in place. But really some unprecedented information that the public, the media, has gotten access to since the public access counselor has been in place. Autopsy reports, subpoenas, arrest reports, police reports, things that we routinely would fight about that a lot of those fights have died down, but there's still an enormous amount of work to be done to make sure that the public has access to that information. In addition, although I don't have the same criminal authority that a state's attorney has, we certainly are in the position, and this is the way the whole system was intended to work, that we get referred cases when a state's attorney is unable to actually act. So in conflicts cases or when they need assistance. And so most recently I can point to a case that was sent to our office from Rock Island County where we indicted and had removed the Rock Island County Sheriff, a Democrat there. And unfortunately, this was the second time we had to remove a county official from Rock Island County several years ago. It was the Rock Island County State's Attorney, similar.
What indictment, can you indict as an office, or do you have to go through the local state's attorney?
So I can't on my own, but when there is either a conflict or the case is referred to our office, so when I have the permission of the state's attorney, then I can. So listen, so let me give it to you this way. The Constitution of the state says very little, right, about what the Attorney General does. There's basically one sentence, and it says the Attorney General shall serve as the legal officer for the state of Illinois. The power, so I'm really the civil lawyer for the state, right? Any day we're defending probably approximately 30,000 cases that have been filed against the state. The law in Illinois also provides to the state's attorneys that they have had and have always had the jurisdiction to investigate, indict, and prosecute criminal cases. There's a statewide grand jury, but even in those circumstances, when I want to activate a statewide grand jury for, and again, it's a limited number of issues.
Drug thing, right?
Bingo. Drugs, guns, and...
Is there corruption one or not?
No, we don't have that. It's something I asked for back in 2009 when the Reform Commission was in place, but even the state's attorneys objected to that change. And historically, I don't know if this is true, but I'm going to tell you what the publisher of the Kankakee paper told me. He is a relative of former Governor Len Small. And so looking at the history, this was likely to be accurate, right? That it was the Attorney General who indicted the governor. And what the publisher said to me was, because he looked up at the very end of our conversation, he said, now you don't have criminal authority, do you? I said, no. I said, you're the only person in the state that knows that. And he said, that's because of my, and I forget if he's grandfather or great-grandfather, this guy, he said, he took it away because the Attorney General indicted him. So about 100 years ago, to the extent the Attorney General ever had it, and I'm not sure that's true because I haven't done the research, it was apparently taken away.
I will say when your Republican opponent, Mr. Schimpf, was here, he talked about just a couple of those public corruption cases you've done, and there's so much out there that you should be doing more, and he would make that a concentration of the office. Your thoughts about that?
My thoughts about that are, one, with even the limited authority that our office has, we've absolutely used it and have not shied away from using that authority, whether it's been, dealing with the Emerald Casino license and having that revoked, a casino that was scheduled to go to Rosemont, or making sure, as we've talked about, even in circumstances where we see an issue and there's certainly a role for the state's attorney's office or even the U.S. attorney's office to play, as you'll recall, and maybe others will as well, I reached out to Dick Devine, then the Cook County State's Attorney, and said, hey, we have credible allegations against the governor and the administration. We want to look into this. And so we were jointly doing that investigation until Patrick Fitzgerald, then the U.S. Attorney in the Northern District, asked us to stop because we were seeking to interview the same witnesses. And again, I can go over a much larger list. I don't have it in my head, but of county-level corruption that is, significant. In addition, we've taken on a lot of the public contracting fraud that I don't know if anybody really has looked at. So, Core Construction, McHugh Construction. Core is the people that did the work over at the state capitol. That was a $800,000 settlement earlier this year. McHugh was a $12 million settlement.
What did they do wrong?
Violated the laws on DBE and MBE, so the minority and disadvantaged enterprises. Usually fronts that they were using. They would say that they were going to give that work to somebody, but they really weren't. So I think we've had about 5 of those cases that we've worked on. In addition, you're probably aware, the work that I've done to make sure, to advise the pension systems, not to provide public pensions to Governor Ryan, to former Governor Blagojevich. Work to try to make sure that John Burge, the infamous commander up in the Chicago Police Department, didn't receive his pension. And the Supreme, yes, he is, and the Illinois Supreme Court, in what I think is just a complete miscarriage of justice, said that the Attorney General does not have the authority to go in and challenge that. So, although we are very clearly in the statute, I think we'll be going to the legislature to have that clarified coming up. So I would say, to the extent, if your goal is to serve as a frontline criminal prosecutor, your job options in Illinois would be either serve as the state's attorney or to serve, have an appointment in the U.S. Attorney's Office. Again, our office has a role to play, but it is not the frontline criminal prosecutor's job. I run the 4th largest law firm in the state.
How many employees do you have?
732.
And how many are lawyers?
370. I can get you up, and that's probably a week or 2 old, so I can probably get you. Take those as approximations. And so last year, and actually I think for the last 5 or 6 years, my GRF for PROP has been $30 million. And last year, in terms of revenue, $992 million. And again, that's only to the state. That is not counting money that we had gotten back for homeowners. So for every general revenue fund dollar I got last year, brought in over $32 back to the state. So a very nice return on their investment, I think.
What happened to the tobacco money?
We're still bringing it in. They securitized part of it. So last year we had a very good year, in part because I challenged the tobacco settlement. Very complex in terms of the work that we've got to do to enforce it, to ensure that we're receiving the money. And so way back there have been challenges by they call them the PMs, the participating manufacturers. We have to diligently enforce the master settlement agreement, which is the settlement agreement for the litigation. And so there's been a challenge of states all across the country as to whether or not the states had sufficiently or diligently enforced the master settlement agreement. So at this point, I think it's about 2 years ago, an arbitration regarding $35 million that had been withheld since 2003. We won. It was found by a panel of judges that we had, in fact, diligently enforced. So this year, in 2014, the money that we got was well over $300 million from the tobacco settlement, and part of it is securitized. I can't remember off the top of my head, Joan, how much of that, but I'm going to guess it's about 150. So half of it goes away, but we still, because we bring in so much above that, there's still some of it that goes into the state, and then, as you know, the legislature gets to decide how that's appropriated.
Oh, I thought there were limitations on what the money could be used for, but it's reported to the general fund.
That is, so don't, you know what? I believe, and I don't know if they have a separate account that it goes into. I just bring it in, and they figure out where it goes. But the initial criticism when the state started receiving those funds, so this was settled back in '98, right, was that the money was not necessarily going toward health care. And I do know that the money came without any strings attached. So it was not specifically directed to the states to use for health care, let's say. And so it went to different things. I do not know if in subsequent years they have put more restrictions on it. I would be doubtful of that, but I would not know off the top of I just don't know off the top of my head.
It is election season, of course.
Is it?
NRI, your opponent, has said that because you were, I think, on the original board of the...
I have a designee on the board.
You have a designee on the board that oversaw the program that spent the $54.5 million. And then you're also advising the legislature...
and I'm doing my job.
Yeah, and he says that that's a conflict because you shouldn't be advising the legislature on how to investigate something you were part of. How do you answer that?
Okay.
Am I right in that?
You did a very nice summary. So here's the situation. And I would say this, and you're probably one of the people in the state that has read Auditor General Holland's report.
I should do better, but anyway, go ahead.
I like
I've heard
I like the
bad words.
confession. It's long. But if you read it, you will find that the board, my office, had nothing at all to do with the, conception, implementation of any of this. And it had already been conceived when it was presented to the IVPA, the then IVPA board. And so it's very clear that our office had absolutely nothing to do with NRI.
Illinois Violence Prevention Authority.
Correct.
Which is now the governor disbanded it, right, or something?
We actually moved the legislation to do it, but yes.
Okay. All right. Well, he claimed,
But yes, and it went over to ICJA, the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, because they're already an entity that gives out grants that tend to be violence prevention. And so, before NRI, if you look at the history of IVPA, it was this little agency. It was on average, $10 million a year. And so suddenly this program came and took it over. And you probably watched or attended the hearings. Okay, so you heard Barbara Shaw's testimony. They didn't have the staff to contend with that. But in terms of the role that our office plays day in and day out, right, as the lawyers for the state of Illinois, we provide legal advice to Democrats, Republicans, elected officials in the state. And so the Republicans and others sought out legal advice, and we provided that to them. There's no conflict there.
There is obviously always the ongoing thing. Your dad's the Speaker of the House, you're the Attorney General of the state. Isn't there a conflict there that you would be less inclined to look at wrongdoing in his caucus or with him or any of that?
Well, you're probably also aware, one of the indictments that I did end up bringing was against a sitting Democratic state representative,
Remind me who that was.
Pat Bailey. So
The
she
one who
had,
the wrong residency.
yeah,
She would file
yeah,
for
that's a criminal
election.
violation.
Can't live in an empty lot.
I don't recall if it was an empty lot or she said it was a home that she didn't live in. I don't remember. But so, and again, the Rock Island County Sheriff is a Democrat. The Rock Island County State's Attorney was a Democrat. We also recently indicted 3 people in the clerk's office in Williamson County in southern Illinois, all Democrats. I think that my record clearly shows that I have not shied away from using the criminal authority of our office. I haven't shied away from going after public and certainly private corruption.
I'm going to get off it after this one question, and it's an older question, but you talked a lot about running for governor. You were talking about it, and then you didn't run for governor and said, well, I was never going to run for governor if my dad was going to run for speaker again, and then your dad came out and said that she knows I was running for speaker again. So where is the disconnect there? Was there some miscommunication between you two? Because it seemed like you were saying different things that didn't fit.
I'm going to say this, that I'm not going to rehash private conversations with you.
I needed to ask.
I understand.
mind.
I understand. What else do you want to know?
One of the candidates for treasurer has been talking about using that office to sue the General Assembly over a balanced budget. Is that something that office could do? Does that infringe on AG?
So, I think the first question there has to be, and you may or may not recall, but earlier this year, and it comes up from time to time, whether or not, the General Assembly can be sued on balanced budget issues. And so this year it came up, I believe we got a request from I know it was Republicans. I'm trying to think if it was senators and House members. And it was basically a question of, it was a constitutional interpretation of, in essence, can the General Assembly appropriate more than, more revenues? And the only reason I'm sitting here trying to have this all download into my brain and come out of my mouth is that you really have to look at these constitutional provisions, and we can probably get you our advice, but we have yet to see a circumstance, truth be told, where the General Assembly is violating the provisions of the law in terms of the budget. So it's either COGFA or one of the entities that is set with determining, and Joan can probably answer this even better than I can, that's set with determining how much money the state has. And then the legislature, I think, is also allowed to adopt an amount. Once they adopt that amount, they're supposed to work within that in terms of their appropriations recommendations sent to the governor that the governor then can choose to sign into law, line item veto, and at the end of the day, all of that gets resolved. So what I would say is I'm sure there are a lot of people who can or would like to kind of throw around, hey, this is how we're going to do something. But if you really look at the law, because this does get brought up to my office, I would say every 2 to 3 years. And when we do, when we look at these things and explain it, it's not a circumstance that we've seen where they have, not adhered to the statutes.
Do you have any opinion, as we call you often the chief legal officer of the state, marijuana, on where the law should go? Should it be decriminalized like Mayor Emanuel wants?
Well, I think what we should do at this point is see what happens in Colorado and is it Washington State, I think are the 2 states right now that have decriminalized. I'd be interested to see how that works well before we start to have that conversation here in Illinois. I mean, we're just at a point where we're trying to implement medical marijuana. And so that is something that is, takes a long time to put in place. So my advice would be, let's watch and see. I mean, unfortunately, I end up doing and have done an enormous amount of work on some of the emerging drug issues. So methamphetamine, the synthetic drugs. We're now doing a lot of work because heroin is out of control. So the prescription drug problems that really are just directly linked to the heroin usage, and unfortunately the tragic overdoses that occur. So I see the bad side of a lot of this. Really couldn't stomach watching Breaking Bad, sort of thing. And so I think the best approach right now would be kind of a cautious approach. We've allowed medical marijuana. Let's get that in place. Let's see what's going on in these other states. And I presume that naturally the conversation, on this decriminalization front will occur, but I'd prefer it occurred with more information about what were the experiences in these other states. I mean, interestingly, I saw something several months ago. I think it was Jerry Brown, right, the governor of California, who made some really interesting comment, about, I'm not so sure this is a good idea to decriminalize. You're like, well, if Jerry Brown thinks that,
Kind of ironic that they got after smoking
right.
To then think about the legalization of marijuana because it is inhaling something that is.
Right, it can't be good for your lungs, right? So, right, there are public health implications as well.
It's a conundrum. Well, no, there are different ways. I understand what.
Yeah, but some of the problems that I've read about in Colorado are that, when it is edible, that.
You don't know the strength.
And so people have gotten horribly sick, right?
Maureen Dowd.
Right, I read that too.
I have a FOIA question.
Sure.
We had a big case, something with Springfield City government, where police internal affairs files were involved.
Mm-hmm.
Is it, just as a law enforcement kind of person, you deal with all those people, do you think the proper stand that police internal affairs files are open? And, what's your kind of...
Well, so it depends what it is, right? I mean, but most of the time...
Yeah.
Well, let's say FOIA, and let's say the exemptions in FOIA. Let's assuming arguendo they're legitimate, so there'll be some information that should be withheld, some people's private information, identifying information. But we have worked. I mean, one of the examples that I gave when I sat in front of the Reform Commission back in 2009, arguing for a rewrite of FOIA and a statutory creation of the Public Access Counselor, was to make sure that police reports were handed over, because we fought endlessly with state police over records that even in our administrative code, it said they were public records and they wouldn't hand them over. So again, I think it's important. So I'm trying to think what else. Search warrants now. So people get search warrants, you get the arrest reports, you get the police reports. There's going to be information, 911 tapes. As I said, autopsy reports. So there'll be information that is legitimately redacted, but unless there is an ongoing investigation and that information would somehow compromise that investigation, yes, that information should be turned over.
What about cameras, which are now being added to police?
Oh, like the body cams? Or you mean the videos from?
Both.
I don't know if anyone's using body cams yet. But.
Body cams, do you have a position on the viability of that as a piece of evidence?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think that, I mean, in other states that have that, I'm pretty sure that's allowed. I don't see, I don't know of any circumstances where there has been, and I could be completely wrong, I could ask my folks, where they've tried to withhold that information. I mean, again, that's part of the record. So those videos are going to come out.
But a police department has to have policies on when they turn the cameras on, when they turn the cameras
Correct.
off, how long they keep things. I mean, all
Correct.
of that can be
But it would,
a factor in whether it's.
but it would be like a piece of paper. It would be considered a public record, right? The same way with the 911 tapes. So right, I mean, I don't see any impediment to turning that information over.
What grade would you give local governments in Illinois for complying with sunshine laws?
It's such a mixed bag. And so when you say local, I mean, do you mean so here? Let me cities. Do you? I mean, it's a completely mixed bag. Here's what I will say. I believe that there has been a significant amount of improvement. That is not to say there are not continuing problems. So I look at it this way. Most people want to follow the law. I have certainly learned over the years that when it comes to FOIA and OMA, the Open Meetings Act, a lot of people had never read the law. So when we went out to do trainings initially a long time ago, and we would say to public bodies and members of public bodies, raise your hand if you've ever read the Freedom of Information Act. Very few hands would go up. And not to disparage members of the media, but there were some members of the media where we trained where they confessed they hadn't read it either. So, okay, one, you're never gonna, it's really hard to follow the law when you don't even know the law. So, part of what's required is making sure that people now get training. We have everybody can get on our website, you can go through our training. It's pretty straightforward. But thank you. So it gives you, a baseline of what you want to know. In addition, the public access counselor, we have a hotline you can call. I think they tell me we field 30 to 50 calls a day. So I will say this. We're training people. We continue to do that. More people know the law. More people now also know that there are penalties for violating the law. And so I've seen increased compliance. Now we're dealing, so more on FOIA. We deal more, or I've at least seen recently, more OMA issues, particularly public comment periods. A lot of our last few binding opinions have been about that. I'm blanking on the community. But you had to sign up if you wanted to publicly comment 5 business days actually before the meeting. So it would be before the agenda was even published. So I don't know how you would know if you'd want to comment because you wouldn't even know if your issue was going to be discussed or not. And we said that's not legitimate. So they had to change that. So it's hard to give them a grade. So how about we give them like a B or a B minus? Because it depends. There are some entities that are difficult, right? From day one, school boards have been difficult, I would say. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Now, I presume that's because most people on a school board, this isn't their full-time job. If it's your full-time job, you probably have run yourself through the training and you probably have to deal with it on a more day-to-day basis. So I'm not saying there's malice involved. I'm just saying that we've seen more consistent complaints at that level. But certainly, police departments sometimes have been difficult, as you know. I mean, again, the laws have changed and the enforcement has increased, so it's getting better. But there remain challenges.
The online training that you were talking about, how is that audited? How do you make sure that governments are doing?
That's a very good question, and somebody in my office probably knows the answer to that question.
Is your sense that most of them are doing it? Or
I do not know.
Okay.
I would hope they are. So I can find out.
I was wondering, when local governments defy the binding opinions
Right.
issued,
So the recourse.
I
Well, at this point, you know what? At this point, the reason that it's not terrible is that if we go to court, then we have law on it, right? So then we have a binding opinion, at the court level, and we can enforce that statewide. So in some ways, whether it's a binding opinion out of our office or it's got to be taken to court to be resolved, we're getting resolution and clarity on what this provision of FOIA means, what this provision of OMA means. So I'm actually okay with that.
The clarity comes if someone can afford to hire a lawyer to take the into court, right?
Well, there's now a fees issue, so we put that in the law. So we've made it possible for people to do that.
So are you going to vote for Governor Quinn, and is he going to win?
Prognostication? That's not what I'm here for. Yes, I'm going to vote for Governor Quinn, and I believe he is going to win. Because I think he is much more honest about what he will do and what he has done.
So in your role as attorney for the state, when it comes to a piece of legislation, say the pension,
Sure.
do you offer an opinion to the legislature?
Good question.
Do you say, we're going to defend that to the end, or we really don't think this is going anywhere with the court?
So let's use pensions as an example. It's kind of a unique example because we knew from day one that whatever was passed would end up in court.
Right.
So actually, let me back up even one more step. In my role as the legal officer for the state, right, if there is a colorable, credible argument to be made, if a state statute or part of the Constitution is challenged, I believe it's my role to defend that. Only in circumstances where something is clearly unconstitutional would we not do that. Okay, now let's go to the pension situation. So with pensions, we knew this was going to end up in court. So for that reason, I never took a personal position on it because I knew I was going to end up in court having to probably defend it. While the legislature had been debating what to do, we certainly provided advice to the legislature. And now we are obviously defending the constitutionality of the pension reform litigation. So does that answer your question about what I view our role is for the state, and then at least in this circumstance how that plays out? In other circumstances it plays out that I might find myself defending a law that I may or may not agree with, but it's not really for me to substitute my personal opinion.
Just as an attorney,
Correct.
in a criminal case, defends the clients that come to him rather than or her.
Right. Not because I necessarily think you're a good guy for what you did, but there is somebody in the process who's charged with making sure that the laws are followed.
When Mr. Schimpf was here, we asked him about Mr. Ronner's plan to go to a 401k for state employees tomorrow. Do you have an opinion on that? Are you able to give one?
No, I'm not giving you an opinion on that. Did you just not hear my answer to that? Well, that's nice.
Might as well ask.
On the issue of data breaches
Sure.
brought up earlier, I think my sense is people are perhaps maybe finally starting to get nervous.
I think people, you know what? So people got nervous when they heard about Target, because I think it's really the first time that anybody focused, because the magnitude of it was unbelievable. At least 40 million people's credit and debit card numbers, up to 70 million people, variety of personal information. But I will say that I've kind of been shocked that a lot of people, when I was talking to them even casually about it in the aftermath of Target, they just kind of looked up and were like, well, I don't know. There's nothing I can do. Chase, the two breaches that people for some reason talked to me a lot about, more so than any others, Chase because it's a bank, and then Jimmy John's just because I think everybody eats at Jimmy John's. I don't know why that was. But to me, Chase is really the worst case scenario, because it's actual proof that there's no institution that holds our personal financial information that can't somehow be compromised. And what I say to people is, you need to know that every hour of every single day of every single week, there are hackers trying to get in to the databases of corporations, banks, hospitals, government, anybody who holds our personal financial information. And from the investigations that we've done, we've seen repeatedly that unfortunately, these companies in particular, sometimes they're not even meeting what should be minimum standards. So we see numerous situations where our information is not encrypted, where there's a known security flaw in the software and the software hasn't been updated with the patch to deal with that. We see all sorts of times where the company's either taken more information they ever needed in the first place for the transaction, or they keep the information for the transaction much longer than they need to, so everything's done, now get rid of it, destroy it. So, I've testified, I went out in February and testified in front of Congress on this issue, and at the time, it was really just in the aftermath of Target and Neiman Marcus and Michaels. But I said, and I think Chase really just brings that home, there almost needs to be, at the federal level, something similar to the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, that comes in the aftermath of, plane crashes, and without saying, we're not here to, criminally indict you, but we want to do a forensic investigation. What happened, and what should we do? What should all of us be doing, whether we're government or a bank or a corporate entity, to put in place security protection so it won't happen again? And I think there's been a real reluctance, certainly on the corporate side, of even acknowledging when these breaches occur because they're so worried about their reputation. And I simply have been saying, listen, everybody needs to know what's happening. You need to do more to better protect your personal information, and certainly you've got to watch over your accounts, and you've got to watch over your credit. You either have to put transaction alerts in place on your credit and debit cards and actually read your monthly statements if you're not already reading stuff more often online. And with your credit, you absolutely have to start getting free copies of your credit report, because the full-blown identity theft is the worst problem to deal with. Well, that's not entirely true. The IRS fraud is worse, when somebody files taxes in your name, and there's really no way to catch that. If you guys saw the 60 Minutes piece a few weeks ago on that. So that's a problem. And there's no, like LifeLock and those sorts of services, they're not going to catch that, unfortunately. So we all have to be much more vigilant. There's much more that I think the federal government, as well as, individual companies, can be doing.
Is there a way for Illinois to get involved in that legislatively, or does it have to happen?
Well, the reason that we passed a breach notification law here years ago is because the feds have never passed anything federally. And so one of the reasons I was out there testifying to the House committee was to say there need to be federal standards in place. Now, the fear is always twofold. One, the federal government can't agree on anything these days. But two, oftentimes when they do try to pass something that would be a national standard, they use that as a ceiling as opposed to a floor. And so there's the chance that even some of the protections that we have in Illinois would be eviscerated if they actually do pass something that is not as strong as Illinois'. And I will say that also in the aftermath of the Chase breach, one of the things that we've been talking about internally is, hey, maybe we need to tinker with our law because, Chase has been unwilling to provide us with, well, what are you really talking about? So initially they said it was 1 million people. Then they came back and had to say it was, 76 million households, 7 million small business accounts. They won't actually give a firm number in terms of the total number of individuals that have been impacted, but the guesstimates are at least 200 million. I mean, they're the largest bank in terms of their holdings in the country. And then the only reason they revealed those numbers and the actual information that was compromised is because they decided that they needed to make an 8K filing with the SEC, which is a voluntary filing that they need to make if they think that there's some exposure for their shareholders. It was this long. And so it said it was people's names, addresses, emails, I forget if it was phone numbers, and they claimed in response to questions that it wasn't account information, but then they had this catch-all in their 8K that said, and other internal user information, but they won't tell us what that is, right? And so one, I think they should tell us what that actually means. And if it's not important, then why can't you tell us what it is? And so we've been talking, as I said, about do we change it so that even if someone's account information or credit card or debit card or whatever isn't taken, that maybe they still have to notify. I mean, it shouldn't be on us to hear about it in the media or to, go onto their website to find out what the situation is.
Do the credit cards with chips on them?
They're helpful. They're
protection?
more, but
If so,
not.
why don't we go to that in America?
So the magnetic strip technology that's used on the back of your credit and debit cards right now is from 1960s, 1970s. We're one of the only countries left in the world, certainly the only developed country that I am aware of that uses such, insecure cards. We haven't gone to it in large part for two reasons. One, Target actually had decided to pilot it in the United States. And because they did it in Chicago, I remember, because I remember seeing these machines. It would be one of those machines that like sucked your card in and held it for a couple of seconds before it spit it back out.
For ATMs?
Yeah, remember? And so Target didn't decide to adopt that because they felt it slowed down their checkout lines.
Oh, I'm sure they would print them.
And two, there has long been, if you need to escape, you're not going to offend me. There's long been an ongoing debate. It's kind of chicken and egg with the merchants and the banks, because obviously it actually will cost a lot of money to adopt, new registers, new technology to implement the system. And so banks wouldn't do it if merchants weren't going to. Don't ask. But that has been their long-term excuse for not doing it. Nonetheless, by the end of next year, by this time next year, we should all have what they call chip and pin technology in our credit and debit cards. Will that protect us 100%? From the reading that I have done, the answer is no, but it should protect us. The estimate I've seen is in 60% of cases. I mean, my advice to people is really basic. In addition to watching over your cards and your credit, it's okay to carry a little cash, right? I mean, you don't need to be using your credit or debit card every time you buy a cup of coffee or you go to grab lunch or whatnot, because that's a big part of the problem. Every single time you use your card, it's in somebody's system, and that system is likely to be compromised, and it's certainly under attack. And, you may or may not have seen it. We issued kind of a re-release on this a month or two ago. Homeland Security, and I'm forgetting what breach it was after. I don't think it was before Home Depot, but they said there are 1,000 companies in this country where they've suffered breaches and they're just not telling you. So you just have to work under the presumption that your information, some criminal has your information, and watch over your accounts and your credit.
We have run up on cheerful note 5 minutes or so. Is there anything that we?
I have failed to tell you. I mean, I can tell you some of the things that I plan on doing because I'm concerned about them. And I didn't even give you my endless spiel about all the great and wonderful things I have done in terms of mortgage fraud. But let me tell you where I'm at in the process, because I've been doing this for so many years. I recently announced what I believe is our 4th or 5th settlement with Bank of America. Back in 2008, I brought the first lawsuit against Countrywide, which at the time was the nation's largest subprime lender. That ultimately settled for an estimated value of $8.7 billion. In the midst of that lawsuit, I was presented with evidence that if you were African American and earning more than $100,000, you were still more likely to be put into a high-cost subprime loan than if you were white and earning less than $35,000. So we did investigations of Countrywide and Wells Fargo, because they were the largest subprime lenders in Illinois, and we were able to substantiate that there was disparities in terms of, identical credit-worthy people just based on race. African Americans and Latinos were paying more. Brought those lawsuits, and then also brought those lawsuits to the Department of Justice, to the Civil Rights Division, and said, listen, if this is happening in Illinois, it's clearly happening across the rest of the country. They likewise engaged in an investigation. Ultimately, we settled both of those lawsuits, 2 largest settlements of fair lending lawsuits in our nation's history. After that, because of all the work that I'd been doing, and I'm skipping some of the stuff on the front end as well, I got to be one of the lead negotiators when it came to dealing with, I refer to it as the national foreclosure settlement, but it was dealing with the robo-signing allegations as well as the servicing problems that people were experiencing when they were trying to have their mortgages modified, and the banks were very unresponsive. So that was a $25 billion nationwide settlement, estimated to bring $1 billion back to Illinois homeowners and communities. Ultimately, we're probably over $2 billion in relief from that overall. And I'm going through all of this because it's also the reason that I now sit on, it's called the Residential Mortgage-Backed Securities Task Force. It's kind of a joint, there are less than a handful of state AGs, but I'm one of them, and Department of Justice, HUD, several other entities at the federal level, where we are, and really what I'm doing on this front is making sure that our pension systems recoup the losses that they suffered by investing in these terrible securities. And so far in the last year, we've settled with Chase, Citi, and Bank of America. The total overall number, I think, is $488 million. And I can tell you how much of that's gone back to the pension system. So Chase was $100 million, Citi was $44, and Bank of America was $200. So $344 back to the pension systems for their losses. The rest of that money, it's similar to some of the relief that was provided to homeowners in the national foreclosure settlement. So it's going to be going to homeowners for modifications, refinancings, a series of different things, as well as blight reduction in communities throughout the state. So that's one. I've still got cases where we're trying to resolve our disputes and recoup money for the pension systems, which maybe you've heard desperately needs help. I need more lawyers in the public access counselor's office. The volume is high, and it's very, very time-consuming to deal with these requests for review. I mentioned nursing home cameras. I mentioned I want to change the law to make it crystal clear that you can't have a circumstance where you have a convicted felon who's able to receive a public pension and that can't be challenged. We didn't spend much time, if any time, talking, but I mentioned it, the student loan issues. So I'm leading a multi-state investigation into Sallie Mae, which is one of, probably the largest student loan servicer in the country, because we're seeing a lot of the problems that we saw on the back end with the mortgages with these student loans, unfortunately. So there's a lot to be done on that front. We talked endlessly about our identity theft and data breach work. So those are some of the things that I would like to continue to work on as your Attorney General, and I would appreciate having your support doing it.